Thanks for joining me again today, you guys. We are back with Yes, It's True, part 3 of my interview with Rob Hamilton. Rob and I went to school together back in our Cap College days, way back. And Rob is the owner and musical director of Side One Band. And so he's got a lot to share with us, both from the perspective of, a working musician, a writer, a guitar player, but also a business owner. Side One has now franchised into 4 cities in total. They really work a lot in the wedding market, but a lot of sort of wedding and convention stuff. And he's got some really interesting perspectives on, client interaction and how to position yourself, what the important things are when you are approaching music from the business perspective and how those two things intersect. So I'm really excited for you to hear the rest of this. Thanks for listening. Here we go. We are back again today with Rob Hamilton. We had so much to say that we didn't get through it all the first time. So you're getting the super extended director's cut with this one.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a bit windy. Yeah.
I prefer to think of it as you've just got so much great information to share. Let's go with that. So let's start off. Side One began as a Vancouver-based band, and it was aimed heavily at the wedding industry. What made you decide to franchise into other cities, and how did you actually do that? How did that play out? What were the hurdles and what worked really well?
Yeah, I think when there was always that sort of idea in the back of my head. In fact, in one of the other bands that I was playing in before I even started Side One, I had mentioned to the band leader, because I found we were flying out to Calgary and Toronto, and I just sort of said you could franchise this. You could just find local players, and provided, it's the same level, and it was just met with, oh, that'll never work kind of thing. I was like, okay. And that was, yet another sort of example of sort of just not being listened to or heard. And as the youngest of 4 kids, being heard is very important. So yeah, that was, I think, always in the back of my mind that this is something that we'll do. So the first city that we moved into, and for your listeners, we're in Calgary, Toronto, Seattle, and Vancouver being our kind of flagship. But the first city that we moved into was Calgary, and I think that would have been about 2014. We had started getting a lot of inquiries from Calgary for a couple of reasons. One of what they call DMCs, or sort of basically event planners for corporate gigs, we had sort of made good friends with. They really liked us. We were kind of like the non-diva band. We were, always sort of hit it out of the park for them. And so we just became their kind of go-to, and they did a lot of events in Banff. So they would often fly us out there, and so that was already sort of a relationship that I had established there, and then from there made inroads with some of the people in Banff at the Banff Springs Hotel and Lake Louise and these kind of places. And they were very impressed with the band, and they were, there's nothing like this out here. I had grown up in Calgary, so I was kind of familiar a little bit with the territory. So it was fun for me to just sort of think, oh, I could make this my first sort of franchise city. I still have friends here and that sort of thing. Not really musician friends, and that was interesting when I started to look for musicians in Calgary. I kind of just looked on Facebook and just sort of looked through my friends on Facebook and sort of went who do I know here, and can this person push me in this right direction? And I put a couple of feelers out to, it was, well, I'm not the guy, but I can introduce you to this guy and this guy and this guy. And eventually I got to a drummer in Calgary who was kind of like what if you've ever read any of those Malcolm Gladwell books, he talks about connectors, and this was definitely that guy. So he sort of knew a lot of people in the circuit, and I kind of watched him play, and I went out there and just sort of like met him for the first time, and yeah, he said, yeah, this would be great. There's another sort of cover band in town that's kind of a big show band, like they have dancers and that sort of thing, but they're off in Asia doing one of these kind of contracts, so there's a real vacuum for this kind of thing. And from there, yeah, just started to meet a lot of the players, and we made a couple transitions along the way. In fact, this drummer that originally helped me figure it out, it was a very tough situation, because although he was a great guy, well connected in the community, he was not the right guy for the job. And I talked a little bit about, like, we'll hire players that are sort of like great people, and like we would rather hire a great responsible person than like certainly the most talented who may be questionable about showing up to the gig and that sort of thing. But there's also a sort of minimum level of talent that really, the way that we kind of do our thing, we try to do what a DJ does, which is going from song to song to song to song. And oftentimes I'll have a talkback mic that's going to people in-ear monitors, where I'll say, okay, let's skip the next song. Let's go right into this, or let's go into that. Or we create these little mini medleys going from one song to the next that have kind of worked out transitions and all that kind of thing. So it's really demanding on a drummer.
That's a bit of a hallmark for you guys as a band, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I know there's a few bands that do that, and even a previous band that I worked in does that a lot. I was kind of one of the founding members of creating that sort of thing with them. So yeah, but it can be like I said, very demanding on the drummer, because oftentimes you'll find on the dance floor, like, if you keep the same tempo, it can really wear out a dance floor. Like when you transition from one song to another song, maybe I'm giving my secrets away now, but in the beginning I was like, okay, I'll create this medley that's at 120 beats per minute, and this will be gold on the dance floor. And I found actually people get really fatigued at, like, they like a new song, but it doesn't necessarily need to be at the same tempo. And one of the things about our drummer, Chris Hockey, he's just like, he's got such an incredible relationship with tempo. Like, he can go from, and it isn't even like necessarily even related through, for the nerds out there, like metric modulations or anything like that. We used to do those kind of things with Soulstream, where we'll start to connect different tempos through a specific a rhythmic sort of division kind of thing. Like the dotted quarter note will now become a triplet or something like that. But that's not necessarily the case with side one. Sometimes it'll be just subito new tempo. And Chris has this unbelievable sort of gift for being able to turn on a dime. So
he's a phenomenal drummer.
Phenomenal. And so it becomes obvious when we have drummers that can't do that sort of thing. And it's such a big part of our repertoire. We don't play with click tracks. So long story short, I mean, again,
long story windy.
Long story windy. This particular drummer that I had, helped me sort of found the band in Calgary, I had to let him go. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I've never really had to fire anybody before. And he was such a sweet guy and such an integral part of that machine. But at a certain point, there's all these drummers that are getting in line as we start to become more and more popular in the city, and we pay well. So musicians, it's starting to like, hey, you should go work for this band. So we have our pick of the cream of the crop there. And unfortunately, it was a very uncomfortable conversation that I had to have. Yeah.
And I get that, like what you're saying about you want the guy who's responsible and show up, and the connections and all those pieces are great. And you're going to take that in the face of two like equally talented players. That's going to be the winning mark. But if the skill isn't there, then all the responsibility in the world isn't going to cut it in the gig. Unfortunately, that's the reality. So get good at your instruments, people. Yeah.
And I give a lot of notes, like I listen to a lot of board mixes, and I will give people like an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
My old joke is it's your gig to screw up. Like I will give you all of the materials to try to make this, for you to come to. It won't be a failure on my part. So
Mm-hmm.
so when I listen back, and no one ever plays the gig perfectly the first time, I get that. So, I will listen back and try to give constructive criticism.
Mm-hmm.
But after like a couple years of working, and I'm still having to listen to board mixes and give notes, and the same notes oftentimes, at some point I just got to go, there's better people for this
Yeah.
job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
so once I got a good team in place in Calgary, it just it really did start to open up, and it's such a great market. There's so many incredibly talented musicians in Calgary and that sort of thing. One thing that we did find, actually, and this might be interesting to talk about, was this approach to this material that a lot of musicians will take. There's a certain caliber of musicians, whether in any city, whether you want to call them studio musicians
Mm-hmm.
or working jobbing musicians, and their approach to learning a song for a wedding or a cover band and that sort of thing. And it often tends to be a bit of a shorthand. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh yeah, Brown Eyed Girl is G, C, and D 145, and we'll just sort of make little notes like that, or even like just a sort of like scratch kind of idea. Whereas I think one of the big successes with Side One is we get into the weeds of these recordings. And I'll admit right now, our band never plays just Brown Eyed Girl just because
Mm-hmm.
it's worn out. But
Yes, I
as we were
believe we
talking about,
covered that in our
yeah,
last
yeah,
interview, actually.
but getting into this very specifics, of like all of these parts, what does the guitar do, Bring, boom, ba, ba, da, and all of this kind of thing is
Mm-hmm.
very important to me. And I think like when I was going into Calgary and I was finding players, they were all very talented. It was kind of a more zoomed out approach to these songs
Mm-hmm.
than what I required. And and I remember specifically with our keyboard player out there, who eventually became one of my band leaders out there, and him having to explain this moment, this aha moment for him, where it was like, I understand what Rob wants now. And it was like this big sort of big fatty mess to kind of get to, because it was just a mindset. Like no one had that
Mm-hmm.
mindset out there. Whereas there's a lot of bands out in Vancouver's here where that was like, we all played in this circuit and sort
Yeah.
of like figured out how to really get in there. But in Calgary, I found it was more like kind of like reading real books or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
So just changing people's mindset to like, no, this is the standard that we want, took a long time.
And then when you franchised into other cities, did you have better language around that to work to that end more quickly in the
100%.
other cities?
Yeah, and I was very surprised by Toronto. And I had, as you said, developed that language to, the next city was Toronto for us. And Toronto was, obviously that is really the cream of the crop as far as
Mm-hmm.
Canadian musicians
Mm-hmm.
go. Like if you are that kind of caliber, oftentimes you move out to Toronto. And so I remember showing up at the first rehearsal for the Toronto band, and there wasn't an iPad, there wasn't like
Mm-hmm.
lyric docs or anything like that. Everybody had the whole thing memorized and were crushing it. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, this is Toronto.
Yeah.
Great. But one of the obstacles that we found out there was, because it's such a cutthroat market, oftentimes singers will have these sort of non-competes. So
Mm-hmm.
they'll only be working with one cover band in the city. And so just to find personnel out there, especially singers, was like, it was insane.
Interesting.
It's still something that I'm kind of dealing with. And thankfully, a couple of our singers from Vancouver actually moved out to Toronto, who are
Yeah.
working in theater, so they're not in the usual market there. But yeah, it was. I remember having uncomfortable conversations, especially as a startup. Like we
Mm-hmm.
can't offer somebody, 50 gigs a year or something like
Mhm.
that. At that point, we were just like, maybe a dozen gigs a year.
Mhm.
And so I think if I like, well, this leads us to our next city. Like, I think doing it again, like people have asked, like, are you going to go into the next city? I think when I started Side One, it was like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and now I'm like Portland, Madison, Palm Springs, like not necessarily
Ah,
places that have good musicians, but not necessarily are just this entrenched kind of thing.
yeah.
So when I moved into Seattle, it was like it was ticking all the boxes because it wasn't as big a market as like a Toronto, but they definitely had events
Mhm.
and money and great musicians. And and there was, again, this kind of vacuum that we could just move in and kind of do our thing. There was no bands at that point doing what we do.
Yep.
So it was cool.
So you've got 4 cities up and running at this moment in time. Um, how does it work managing them from a distance? Do you have local band leaders in each city? Do you fly out sometimes? What does that look like?
So for the first couple of years, I will fly out, and as I was saying, like the gigs, obviously you're not just showered with 50 gigs or something like
Right.
that to begin with. So maybe it's a dozen gigs a year, so I can afford to sort of play the long game and just sort
Mhm.
of go, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to be the band leader for the first at least year, maybe in some cases 2 years, and sort of like teach them how we do it and make sure
Mhm.
everything is running smoothly, and then hand it over. And that's what I've done in all of the cities. And now it was just such a great feeling when I could just like, I've got these incredible band leaders in those cities where it's like, yeah, I can just hand over the reins and they know exactly
Mhm.
um what's going on.
Yeah. That's that has to be so integral to what you do because you really do, as you've explained, do things uh in a very specific, pretty precise way that isn't just how every other band does it. So having those function from afar, you have to have somebody who can basically fill your shoes, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've people have asked me like about like business books that I've read and that sort of thing. And I've tried to read like some of the big ones, Good to Great and all of these ones and
Mhm.
leadership books and everything like that. And I just don't find them very, I think there's like a sort of culty quality to a lot of them that I'm just sort of like, ugh, it seems gross, and just kind of very robotic and stuff like that. But honestly, and this may be ironic to what I just said, one of the greatest like books or the most applicable books to Side One that I ever read was one called Leading the Starbucks Way.
Yeah.
And it was exactly the model that Side One is. And it seemed like it was, think what you want about Starbucks. I think there is this sort of pejorative thought about it, which is like now that it's so pervasive and everywhere, that you kind of have this like, and there's like the mom and pop shops and the cool coffee shops that only
Mhm.
offer like three things with a barista that hates you and stuff like that. But like, and people are into it. They're like, yeah, the,
Yeah.
the less items we have on the menu and the more the barista gives me attitude, the more I think it's great.
The more I'm gonna spend.
That's right. But, the Starbucks model has always been interesting to me because, especially in the beginning, things are starting to change there now, and I'm not sure I like the brand is sort of like keeping that same sort of thing that they began with, which is like I remember walking into Starbucks and hearing like Wes Montgomery or like Barney
Mhm.
Kessel or like
Mhm.
these. I was like, who's ever programming this music knows what they're doing. Like, this is very interesting, and just sort of the warm, and it's like, and you could always count on it. Like, if you're ever on the road, like as a musician, you don't have, it's either Tim Hortons or like you can try to find the mom and pop shops, but oftentimes you don't have a chance. And so you just want to like make sure that you're not going to blow your $6,
Yeah.
per diem for coffee on, so you can count on this sort of thing. So
Consistency.
for consistency. So we kind of wanted that for Side One. Like, one of the big barriers that, you know, in this particular, the cover band industry, is these people are spending thousands of dollars. They just want to make sure they're not giving it to some bonehead that is
Mhm.
doing this on the weekend. And like that, in the beginning, we actually rented an office like downtown Vancouver,
Mhm.
not for any reason than just to sort of make it look like we're legitimate. I
Mhm.
think like when we would bring brides and grooms to our office space that we rented in downtown Vancouver, they were like, okay, these guys are actually
It's
like a
legit.
legitimate thing.
Yeah.
So when you see like our big truck show up with all the PA and that sort of thing, like, okay, thank God these guys like are not just, they're not just heroin addicts that are like trying to make ends meet between album cycles,
Yeah.
like so we wanted to really give the air of like consistency. This is a brand that you can trust. And I think like we eventually kind of accomplished that. And so this book that I read, Leading the Starbucks Way, was kind of all about that. And they said the same thing. Like, we wanted to give people the thought that, like, no matter where they are, they can count on this thing to be very good
Mhm.
and consistent. So, and the sort of embrace of technology too, through like, I remember the first time I ever paid for anything on my phone was at a Starbucks, and I thought,
Mm.
oh, this won't be the last time I do this.
Mhm.
And it made me think about our band too. Like, I don't know if you knew this, but I built an app about I don't know, it's like 7 or 8 years ago for Side One. So all of our musicians are connected to this thing, and it's been actually like incredible for me. Like, when I built it, it became a really rewarding experience. Like,
Mhm.
actually just doing this thing that I knew was going to solve problems. Like, and people like my musicians would come to me and they're like, how can we get the hotel information? Like, my Calgary band might be staying at some hotel in Banff or something like that. And at that point, it's like Dropbox folders and everything like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And it was, or with Google Docs and all of this kind of stuff. And so we just sort of like, I built this one place where our admin team, our musicians, our clients can all sort of go and get their information. And it was like, and just from a sort of personal, like, I don't know what, if you want to call it, like getting a sense of meaning for me,
Mhm.
that was
Mhm.
like, it was incredible. My brother is a computer programmer, and I sort
Yeah.
of like, I said, like, I'm toying with this idea of a database. I don't know how this works. And he said, come over for an afternoon. I'll kind of show you a little bit on how it goes, and you can just like do the tutorials. And so I got this. Well, actually, it even started further than that. I went into the Apple store. I said, I've got all these like spreadsheets, and they said, oh, you need a database. And I was like, okay, what's a database? I seem to remember something about like Cap College computer, 101, doing some database
Microsoft
stuff.
Access.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just fell in love with this stuff, and I really got into it, and like it really touched that sort of nerdy part of my brain. And it's to this day it's really fun. Like, I do like,
Yeah.
I do a lot of stuff with it. So the program we use is FileMaker Pro, and they're now Claris. They got bought out by another company, but it was literally just like, you open up the program, and it's just like just a blank box, and you just go, okay, how do I begin? And I just like started doing all the tutorials, and like if I had a question, I'd ask my brother, and he'd help me out with like a formula or something like that. But it was really, really fun, and it's indispensable now.
Yeah.
Like, to our company would fail if we
Yeah.
didn't have this.
Yeah. And I mean, total side note, but I get that. I love the like nerdy stuff that isn't necessarily it's not what it looks like on, like, I love building websites. I love building websites. And that is definitely not like my job description, but I've built so many, and like for me and for some other people, but it's not like what I do, but I totally get into it. And anyway, so I get that. Like, when you find a thing that, ooh, I can A, learn, B, do something that's super useful for me, and have like this sort of, you're tweaking the creative part and the nerdy part all at once, right? Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, love that. All right. So let's talk about, because you definitely have some mileage on this one. the realities of gigging at home versus on the road, because those are two different animals, right?
Yeah. Um, yeah. So I can speak a lot to the road. Like I've been with just creating the bands in all of these different cities. I've flown and driven a lot, and and that's kind of fun too. Like in the same way that creating a database is really fun.
Hmm.
There's a problem solving element to traveling as well that I
Yep.
really love. Just as far as like gear and cases and all of this stuff and trying to make things like because as the owner of my company, checking a bag is costing me money.
Yeah.
Like every time there's an expense, I cannot expense my clients if I'm building a band in Calgary. Like that's all
Hmm.
coming out of my pocket.
Yeah.
So I want to try to get these things down to as bare minimum as I can. I would say to somebody that's like starting into this, um, get onto some sort of rewards program as far as like your credit cards,
Hmm.
as far as your hotels, like pick the same hotels, as far as like airlines that you're choosing. Just like I'm always going to be an Air Canada person, or I'm always
Hmm.
going to be a WestJet person, rather than just always going for, because things like checked bags are now like, every time you check two bags, which is guitar and pedals,
Hmm.
that becomes like $80 one way, $80 the next way.
Hmm.
It's prices are going up now. So it's like an extra $200. So maybe you're saving that money in like, oh, if I pick this WestJet flight, but if you eventually get to this level in your rewards program, you don't have to pay for your bags. They
Yeah.
all of a sudden are become free. So those little hacks are like, those are amazing. Hopper is a great, like if you're just looking for cheap flights, that's all these apps now to try to hack your
Yeah.
travels just to try to save money is like, they're so great.
So that absolutely addresses it from the sort of organizational point of view, which is really useful. And from the performance point of view, um, how do you, if you guys, okay, so say you're in a band situation where you're on the road and there's travel, and like there's pieces around fatigue that come from travel that come out in, it's most apparent for singers because we hear it in their voices, like over some of the more strictly mechanical instruments, maybe. But there's things like, just some realities around managing pieces of working on the road and the requirements of that actually affect performance too.
Oh yeah, there's the one thing that I found very surprising with all of these trips to Calgary is
Mhm.
how different the air is.
Yeah.
And I will have like in the beginning when we used to fly the Vancouver band out and we play long sets. Like we do 90-minute sets, uh and that can be like extreme, even though we're switching from guy tune to girl tune, guy tune to girl tune,
Mhm.
it still is like can be like really challenging for a lot of our vocalists.
Mhm.
And so tack on that we're playing in the Rocky Mountains, and I didn't really even like take this into account. Like by the end of the first set, Rebecca and Martin are like
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
what's going on in this place. And what's also interesting is with my Calgary team, them not even noticing it. I'm like, no, this is a thing. And they're like, no, it's not. And it's like, well, you've just been here all of your life. Like you are used to this kind of
Yeah.
air in this world. And the extreme of that is we've done gigs in like Colorado, where we're
Mhm.
literally like a mile up, and like they're offering oxygen to our singers on the breaks and
Wow.
stuff like that.
Okay, I've played a couple of those. I was not offered oxygen, but I definitely felt it. I was like, "Ooh, the air is thin here, and I have to make sure that I'm not dancing around too much on stage because that uses up all my air that I need for singing." Like some kind of weird considerations like that, that if you're not used to that kind of travel, just aren't front of mind.
Yeah, here's another thing, and this is maybe not even necessarily travel, but like gets into the idea of fatigue. So
Mhm.
we will, as we became more and more popular, there it wouldn't be unreasonable for us to have a gig on Friday night, a gig on Saturday night, a gig on Sunday,
Mhm.
and before, like, especially in our first like couple of years where maybe we weren't booking, we didn't have the bullpen that we do now, it'd be like, Martin and Rebecca, I need you. We've booked these gigs, and it's good money too. Like they can
Yep.
make, $1,500 for the weekend. That's pretty good for, for at home. And so 3 hours of singing, each of those nights, and especially for Martin, who was, a baritone singing, trying to sing tenor in
Tenor
our
stuff.
band,
Yeah.
it was like, it became debilitating for
Mm-hmm.
him, and he eventually had to kind of retire out of the band, just because of that sort of thing. And for me, I'm just the guy that's like emailing people, right? I'm
Yeah.
just like, and he, even though Martin has like a lot of experience as a singer, probably singing 9 hours on a weekend was something that was kind of new to him
Mm-hmm.
just as a performer. And so, and especially this type of material,
Yeah.
so he didn't even know like what his capabilities are, and he didn't want to let anyone down.
Mm-hmm.
So now, because of that, and all of a sudden, come the next weekend when we have 3 gigs, all of a sudden I have no singers because
Mm-hmm.
everybody's like, sucking
Worn
on,
out.
honey tea and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So I really had to become like a baseball manager at a certain point and really treat my singers as like pitchers,
Yeah.
and have a bullpen and ready and not schedule people. Now I do have like just workhorses that will just, I can just work to death.
Yeah.
And you hear these stories of like, Robert Plant just on the road nonstop
Mm-hmm.
for years, and just like, yeah, no problem, we can do this. And or Bruce Springsteen or something doing 3 hours a night for
Mm-hmm.
40 nights in a row, and you just go like, how does that work? And so there are those type of people, but I cannot count on those because like I have contracts and I have, so I
Yep.
try to stagger these things, and maybe something you want to talk about, but now that I do have this bullpen of musicians, like how I'm scheduling people becomes, I don't want to let anybody down, and who gets priority over these gigs, and like, is it talent? Is it just like, how does it all kind of work? But one of the most important things now that we're, very busy is just making sure that I don't burn anybody out.
Yeah. So do you want to talk further about that, what that process looks like? Because I think that, I mean, certainly for singers, there has to be, especially knowing that, okay, you have a bullpen of singers, there has to be some responsibility on the person to be able to say, and freedom, like that has to be an invited, they have to know that it's safe to say that, you know what? I need to like take a rotation out this weekend because I'm feeling burnt out, and know that you've got the coverage for that. Um, so I think it's a shared responsibility is what I'm getting to.
Absolutely. And I kind of trust people to kind of tell me, you
Yeah.
know, like, and it is nice that we have so many people that we can, or like, I mean, it was especially difficult during COVID because, of course, people would get COVID like two
Yeah.
days before
Yeah.
a
Very
gig.
last minute, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that became an extra complication. But I mean, thankfully, it all kind of worked out. We never had any, major issues. We were able to keep people, like somebody on the stage at all time without
Yeah.
sacrificing, any sort of drop in quality.
Which is also a huge advantage for being in the position where you are, where you do have a bullpen. It's not just these are our six guys, and if one of them's down, we're either subbing out to somebody who's never played with us before, or we have to give up the gig.
Yeah, that's right.
I just want to speak to what I just said around that part of the responsibility needs to land on the performer to say, I I need a break, like raise their hand. And that only works when it's set up as a situation they are not in fear of losing the further gigs if they speak up, because that's the industry standard, right?
Yeah.
If you say, as a singer, if you say, I gotta sub out. I'm not feeling good. I can't do this. I'm burnt out. I'm sick. I'm whatever. The fear is now you're not going to get hired because now you're difficult or whatever.
Right. There is, yeah, I mean, and there's a sort of like counter to that as well, which is, we do pay fairly well
Yeah.
so that, but ironically, this will give people a lot more, they'll feel a lot more freedom
Yeah.
to sub out. So, maybe, a little tickle of the throat,
Hmm.
all of a sudden they're like, you know what? I made enough money this weekend. I'm going to sit this one out. And all of a
Hmm.
sudden the rest of us have to scramble.
Hmm.
The person that's coming in to sub, is getting the set list like kind of the day before. Maybe it's all of a sudden inconvenient to them, but it's no big, deal for the singer that's subbing out because, they're not feeling the pinch. So I've actually had, the kind of
Both
opposite
ways.
problem
Yeah. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
that, which people are a little too easy to sub out now.
All right. Thanks for joining in today, you guys. We will be back on Thursday with part 4 of my interview with Rob. And that will be the wrap up, I promise, at least for this season. We might have Rob back in another season, but for this season, we will wrap it up on Thursday. So